Eva Horne, Assistant Director of Konza Prairie Biological Station.
You herpetologist, okay. So this is going to be probably a little bit different than maybe what you had, because we're just going to go through most of the species of herps that you find in Kansas and talk about some specific species that I've worked on and that I find some really interesting things about, because we do have a lot of really interesting critters here. And to sort of start off, I was going to put them in perspective of other organisms. So herpetology, or herps, are all reptiles and amphibians. And those are two pretty big groups. So if we look at mammals, there's a little over almost 6,000 species of mammals known currently. Almost 10,000 birds. Fish have everything. And this is probably nowhere near how many fish are actually out there, because nobody's really cataloged anywhere near all the fish. So lots and lots of fish. But when you look at amphibians, they're right up there between birds and mammals. Reptiles have mammals topped. And we still don't know that this is all of them, because it's only been recently with a lot of the Dioxin amphibians that we've really started looking at these things. And we're doing genetic studies now. We're splitting things out into new species. So things are getting renamed. Some of the names the scientific names that I'm using may not be ones you've seen in the past, if you know anything about these from the past, because they're being changed and shuffled around. We had genera that spanned the world before. Now they're splitting them up into continents as we learn more and more about their relationship. So a fair number of organisms. And if we look at, split them out, so these are all the amphibian, major groups of amphibians. We have caecilians, salamanders, and then frogs and toads. You're probably familiar with what frogs and toads and salamanders look like. Caecilians are actually legless amphibians. They burrow in the ground. They're tropical, so we don't have any in the U.S. And they're very small. And this is 192 is probably way underestimating them, because you actually have to go down and dig around in the jungle to find them. So it's not very easy to catalog the caecilians. With reptiles, there are several major groups of reptiles. We have turtles, crocodilians, and then Tautara. There is one species, Tautara, and they're kind of an interesting critter. We'll talk about them a little more here just in a second. The more common ones, Amphibians, lizards, and snakes. These are in a group separate from these others. There are people now who don't even want to include turtles and crocodilians as reptiles. So the book that I have here that I brought is a good reference for you. Joe Collins was one of the people who wrote this, and it says amphibians, reptiles, and turtles. Because of the phylogenetic relationship, turtles are not as closely related to the rest of the reptiles as we once thought. So there's some thought of putting turtles out in their own class.
Will you go ahead and define phylogeny?
Phylogeny? Okay. Phylogeny is the evolutionary relationship of organisms. So how they evolved to be what they are today. And so we can look at some of that using genetics, sometimes using morphological characteristics. And it's since we started using genetics that we're learning a lot more about the relationships of things. And that based on morphology, as organisms evolve to fit a particular environment, they may look the same as an organism in another part of the world that is in this very similar environment. So if you look at just how they look, you may think that they're very similar to each other and that they're related. But once you look at their genetics, they only evolved those characteristics because they live in similar habitats, and they may not be closely related at all. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, snakes and lizards you're probably familiar with. Amphibians are like caecilians. They're legless reptiles. And again, they're mostly in the tropics, though we do have some in some of the northern continents too. And again, these are not very well known. There are none of these in Canada. but they are a group of reptiles. So the reason there is only one species of Tautara, they live in New Zealand, and they look a lot like an iguana. They look like a regular old lizard, right? But if you look at their skull, they have a skull that's called Dioxin. And it's called Dioxin because di means two. It's got two holes in the back of the skull. This is the eye socket and then the nostril. And Tautoras and crocodilians have this type of skull, which is thought to be sort of the ancestral condition of reptiles. And they are the only lizard-like species that has that kind of skull. If you look at turtles, they have what's called anaxins, so they don't have any openings back here. And they seem to have lost those openings in the skull. And then these more advanced, what we call the more advanced reptiles, have what's called a modified Dioxin skull. So it's got one hole, and then the other hole's been modified for jaw structure and that kind of thing. And birds also have this kind of skull. Mammals have what's called a synapse. They only have one hole. So you can classify vertebrates by how many holes they have. I think I'm like the multi-outside. These numbers come from these websites here, and they update AmphibiaWeb fairly frequently with species numbers. So that number has probably changed since I put it up here. The reptile database doesn't update as often, but you can find new species listed there. Okay. Any questions on this? See you later. Kind of sense. Okay. So when we talk about reptiles and amphibians in Kansas, you have to talk about the weather because, as you all know, and is this the rainfall map? So the rainfall map, and one of my colors vanished there. There's another one there. As you know, you have a lot of rainfall in the southeast, and it gets less and less as you go west. There's also some geological interesting things going on in there. There's something down here called the Red Hills, and a variety of different features to the landscape. But rainfall is really, really important for especially amphibians and for a lot of the turtles, and for a few of the snakes and lizards. So if we look at species in the state of Kansas, for amphibians we have 30 species. Those that cover pretty much the entire state, there's only 8. So not very many that span the entire state. If we split it up into sections, this western 2/3, there's only 1 species. And the eastern third, which would be, kind of the border of the tall grass, you have 9. So as you get further east where there's more moisture, you get more species. And especially that really moist southeast corner, you can add an additional 5 species to those 9. And Cherokee County has 3 species that you don't find anywhere else in the state. Cherokee County is kind of off. The southern border down here, where it's drier, you pick up 2 more species. So there are things that are different that live in that area. And then the Red Hills have an additional amphibian species that is not anywhere else in the state. We see similar patterns in reptiles, though there are more of them, so there's 68 in the state. Those that have ranges that cover most of the state, there's 25 species. 6 in that western half, an additional 6. 19 in the eastern third. 7, an extra 7 down in that corner down there. And then these are mostly turtles in the reptiles. And then this one is the cottonmouth in Cherokee County. These 3 are introduced species that come from Italy and the Mediterranean and things like that. And they're probably escaped pets from those 2 big cities. Out here we get, again in the dry south, additional 6, and another 1 in the Green Hills. So rainfall is very important, and then geology is also very important to this rainfall. And the amphibians. And you'll notice that there are these interesting groupings on the borders, and there's a split this way. Kansas seems to be made up of species that come from various other directions, and we're sort of the edge of their range. So a lot of these species were the western edge of their range, or we're the eastern edge of the range, or the northern edge of the range. And then they don't go any further. So Kansas being where it is, sort of, we get all these things from all different directions. And only the ones that can really handle this habitat here and the weather here are going to sustain well. So starting with amphibians and looking at toads, we have 7 species in the state of Kansas. If you see this little red icon here that looks kind of like Konza, that's one that's also found on Konza. Though I have never actually seen one of these out here. Supposedly they are. This is one of the most primitive toad species. It's called the spiny foot. In other species of these out further west, they hatch out in tadpoles and these little pools. And metamorphosis in frogs is controlled by thyroid hormone. And there's a fairy shrimp that will hatch out into those pools that is full of thyroid hormone. And if they start eating those fairy shrimps, they will partially metamorphose into these carnivorous monsters, and they will eat all the other tadpoles in the pool. So it's really kind of weird. So I don't know if the ones, I don't think the ones here do that, but there's species further west that do.
Is that new research? That's fascinating.
Oh no, that's been around forever. So they sound like this if you happen to be out walking around. Maybe they sound like this. There's another frog in the background. It's the loudest one up front. Okay, you quit now. It was longer than I expected. Okay. Here are the 2 most common toads around. Woodhouses is very common here. You see them fairly frequently. And this is one of those groups where the genus name has changed. This used to be Bufo, if you're familiar with that. So woodhouses here, Great Plains toad. And